Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization with your daily video update for April 14th, 2025. Well, this was an extremely busy and hectic weekend with a lot of developments, a lot of disinformation coming out through the mainstream media. So I'm going to go through some of what we're watching and how we're intervening to try to pull the world back from a chaotic descent into war and depression. And it's possible to win this fight. The problem is that the disinformation is designed to keep people on the sitting on the couch watching in disbelief as things that you thought you knew are falling apart. So let's get right to it. Here's what we're looking at. First, you have the U.S.-Russia normalization process underway. This is something that President Trump is committed to. It's useful. It's extremely important, actually, a total break from the previous year's Biden policy, which put us on a course toward nuclear confrontation with Russia. Now, we're still not out of the woods yet because you have the Europeans pushing for rearmament and escalation against Russia. But the negotiations are continuing between the U.S. and the Russians, and it's not just Ukraine. There are a whole range of strategic issues, including how to deal with Iran, how to deal with the trade problems and the global finance. And some of this is going to require some shifts in U.S. policy away from sanctions and away from the attack on Russia and China. But the direction here is, for the most part, going in the right way. Now, second issue, Iran. You had the first meeting and discussion that took place on Saturday in Oman. This is really significant because there's a push coming from Netanyahu and the Zionist lobby in the United States, insisting that the United States must join Israel in an attack on Iran. This would be a devastating failure and would be a tragic catastrophe because of the implications of the repercussions of such an attack. That is, the likelihood of a regional war that could become World War III. Now, what's important is that the discussions took place, including a very brief but important direct discussion between the U.S. envoy and the Iranian foreign minister. They agreed to meet again next Saturday. And this is useful because Trump does clearly put the idea of diplomacy ahead of war, although the threats that come from him don't really help. Now, meanwhile, Netanyahu is in deep trouble. His policies are harming Israel, both in terms of its security, its economic policy. It's isolating Israel further. And quite frankly, it makes the United States and Israel's European allies complicit in genocide. Now, Netanyahu's doing this because he's completely dependent on extreme forces in Israel, those who favor forced expulsion of the Palestinians, the so-called ethnic cleansing, who are behind the idea that you have to cut off all food, all aid to the Palestinian population to force them to wish to emigrate. And the United States, up to this point, has given Netanyahu a free hand in Gaza and in the West Bank. The question is, will Netanyahu convince Trump to join Israel in a strike against Iran? And remember, Netanyahu's not only doing this to maintain the support of people like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich and these crazy Greater Israel fanatics, but he's got a problem in the United States from so-called Christian Zionists, the Zionist lobby, and the neocons who want war. So this is one of the fights that has to be won. Now then you have the China question, and this is made more difficult by the trade war. Are we going to keep escalating tariffs back and forth, tit for tat? And why? This is a war that the U.S. can't win. Minimally, it's going to harm both countries, but the Chinese have a much greater area of cooperation with the countries of the global south, whereas the U.S. is becoming increasingly incapable of appealing to these countries, and the U.S. Trade with the global south is far less than China, whereas China keeps increasing its trade relations. Trump has to talk with Xi Jinping. He says he likes Xi, he respects him, so set up a discussion process. The idea of preparing for war with China, this is what the neocons want, this is what a section of the U.S. military wants, and this would be, again, another disaster, because even the military people who are calling for confronting China acknowledge that the United States could not win a conventional war, and if you go to nuclear war, forget the planet. Now that brings us to the tariff policy. And as I reported to you last week, the big problem there is the failure to identify what's the crisis. It's not just that we have a trade deficit, we have a budget deficit, an incredible amount of debt built up, at a point in which we're deindustrializing the United States with green policy, with regulatory policy, and so on. The move of the Neo-Liberals and the World Trade Organization toward a global free trade agreement has led to outsourcing and deindustrialization. It can't be solved by tariffs alone. You need a change overall in policy. Now, part of that change is that Trump has to dump some of his economic team. I just got off a discussion where we're going to put together a report on who are the people behind the tariff policy. Is it Stefan Miron, the head of the Council of Economic Advisors? Is it Kevin Hassett, a longtime Bush Republican operative who is now a top advisor to the Trump administration? Well, clearly these are people who are ideologues who don't understand how the American system works. Now let me give you the view from London, the City of London. This is from the April 10th Economist magazine. And what they write is, America's financial system came close to the brink of collapse this past Tuesday, April 8th. The failure of both risky stocks and supposedly safe assets, namely treasuries, at once threatened to destabilize the financial system itself. Goes on to say, turbulence may well return. Should trading seize up once again, the Fed would have to intervene, acting as the buyer of last resort and offering emergency loans to systemically important firms in need. In other words, bailouts, a replay of the 2008, post-2008 collapse, the 2019 to 2021 flow of quantitative easing to provide money to essentially bankrupt banks. Then the Economist goes on and says, there is the question of how far central bankers can use monetary policy to ease financial conditions and reduce the risk of systemic damage. It would be reckless to assume the shocks are over, or that foreign investors' faith in American assets, now shaken, can be magically restored. How much more can the system take before something really does break? Unquote. London Economist, the mouthpiece for the British banking system centered in the City of London. Now, that's the strategy that's being applied by the City of London to undermine the Trump administration. As we've reported repeatedly, their goal is to, if not get rid of Trump, fence him in so he can't do anything that breaks the containment put up by the monetarist forces that are protecting a collapsing empire. Trump correctly wants to break out of that imperial policy. But with his gang of advisors, with the creeps in the Republican Party in the Senate and the House, and the absolute disastrous collection of the Democratic Party, there's no obvious pathway except the LaRouche solution. Now, what the Europeans are going for is rearmament, maybe even setting up a new bank that they can use to provide liquidity for an arms buildup, which will not solve an economic crisis and will likely lead to World War III. So we need to have more discussion of LaRouche's ideas, which is starting to take place. The question of Hamilton, the question of Friedrich List, of Henry Clay. These are the people, Henry Carey, these are the people who put forward an idea of where tariffs are effective as part of a national policy of credit to industry, to innovation, to science and research, to new technologies. That's the solution. And we've put out a 3-page memo that's available to any one of you who want to look into it. Those of you who write to me and say, well, how do you solve this? Take the link in the description section and download the report that's available, which will give you an in-depth picture of what caused the crisis and what has to be done. And this is the way we're going to take the power away from the City of London to undermine the United States and to provide the answers to the questions of how do you revive manufacturing? How do we increase productivity in the American workforce, which has been in decline overall since 1971? So take the time now to read our report. Send me your questions or your comments. Let's make sure that we have a dialogue going in the United States that's powerful enough to overcome the lies and disinformation coming through the mainstream media. So we'll have more on this tomorrow as things unfold.